Hi, everybody. Welcome to another talk on this series of project management for UX. If this is your first time with us here, let me introduce myself. My name is Itamar Medeiros. I'm originally from Brazil. Um, I I'm a UX designer or a graphic designer by background, but for the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of design management and strategy. So in this series, we've been talking about some of the skills that designers need to acquire in order to get unstuck. And this is the third of a series of talks that we're having about project management. So in the first one we talked about provide vision and direction. Then the last chat we talked about coaching and mentoring team members. So today we're going to be talking about negotiation, issue, and conflict resolution. And and here's something that I guess I'll preface in this conversation here is this. This is probably the most this is going to be probably the most difficult of these chats, because if conflict and issue resolution were something that was easy to be done, we wouldn't be like, the world wouldn't be in the state that we are right now. Let's say as of the time of this recording, we are in the second month of a war in Ukraine. We have like probably the most polarized politics in the history of mankind. So people just don't want to, maybe don't want is a bit struck, but people are struggling to deal with differences, right? And that's what usually issue and conflict resolution is all about. It's helping people to deal with conflict. So by no means I'm gonna claim that I know how to resolve everything and my life is conflict free. It's the opposite. I'm still learning every day on how to get better at any of these. So what I'm here to share is some of the things I learned the hard way, but also some of the best practices that, while it might be difficult to implement, it might be something that that at least is going to get a great conversation started with your team, right? So if you don't have time to go through the whole video, here's a few takeaways for you, right? So in any kind of collaborative environment, and let's say, since we're talking about UX here, most UX projects are either software or some sort of product that involves a very diverse team of people working together, like software developers, UX designers, testers, product managers, and so on. In any kind of collaborative environment, solution is not purely based on technical problem solving. Usually there's a lot of compromise and negotiation involved, right? Unless you're working, let's say you're working on a small project, you are the designer and you are the product manager and you are the developer. And I've seen, let's say, that's how a lot of products in, for example, let's say the App Store from iOS, that's how a lot of small products get done. But all it takes is for more than one person to be working on the same project, that you're gonna have to have some sort of compromise and negotiation, and at some point resolve conflicts. And conflict here, we're not talking about people out fighting. We're talking about how do you deal with once people have difference of opinions. We could do either this or we could do that, right? Let's say which way we want to go. Which brings us to the second point. Let's say conflict arises in every team. It's just the nature of working with people that are different than you, right? So what we need to do is find ways to channel the energy of conflict into constructive disagreement, right? So we're gonna be talking about a few techniques, like how do you create psychological safety for people to disagree constructively? How do you what are the best practices to resolve conflicts, right? But finally, from a project management perspective, what we want is let's say, in the end of the day, what we want is for people to move on, right? So the idea of resolve conflicts, we have clear intention. It doesn't really matter if we're all on the same page, the team is conflict free, but nothing gets done. What we want is to resolve the conflicts, create a shared vision, and then turn into action, right? Converting potential value into real value requires action. So, um, so let's talk about conflict and negotiation, conflict resolution, right? As I was saying, if you, I mean, I think we've been talking now for two, in the first two parts, I've shared a couple of my opinions that is only natural. Let's say if you let the team to chance, it's only natural that they will stray away from vision, right? Because let's say we create a vision, we set project goals, and we're just humans, right? Let's say it's not like we are like once we create a vision, everybody's programmed and they're gonna get fixated on that vision. What happens is like we might cast a vision and different people might have different opinions about how that vision gets implemented. So that's why I mentioned in the first two parts of this series, you really need to help the teams to paddle in the same direction by having some intentional facilitation, right? So even when the project team has really a clear vision and the managers have created all kinds of like pep talks and all kinds of um, mechanisms and artifacts to share what that vision is, we need to get the team to constantly be paddling in the same direction, and that's not going to come natural. You have to have someone facilitating that that process, right? And since we're talking about project management for UX, the one of the most natural conclusions that you can make is that that person will be the project manager. Sometimes in your project there is no fixed project manager. That's why I'm suggesting, and this has been my experience in a lot of projects, is this, then the designer steps up to the plate and facilitates those discussions. And this is not because I think designers are the most prepared. Well, I mean, one could argue that some of the skills that we have, things like, for example, problem needs and user-centered design in terms of understanding pain points, kind of makes us a very good candidate for that kind of role. It's just that in my observation is some of the some of the issues that the project teams struggle when it comes to lack of shared vision and shared direction of where we want to go end up hurting UX more, because like we needed the team to stay on track if we wanted to deliver the vision that UX created in the beginning of the project, right? So for today we're going to be talking about twofold, right? Say the negotiation part of this process, and we're going to be talking about the conflict resolution, right? So as I was saying in the beginning, right, the design is a collaborative environment. It is a negotiation of multiple disciplines. As going back to the example, unless you're a craftsman, that you, let's say you design whatever object that you're creating and then you also execute it, most of the times you're going to have to be negotiating with other disciplines, software development. I mean, if you're working on software, you're negotiating with software development, product management, testing, QA, user assistance. Like some organizations tend to have multiple roles or multiple disciplines. Other organizations tend to be a little bit more lean. But in most cases, it is at least a three-way conversation, right? Product designers or UX designers in this case, product managers and developers, right? Um, so it's not about how technically capable the team is about, well, like, what are the compromises that need to be made? Like, for example, oh, this solution is great, but we don't have the time for it, right? But then the developers come back, it's like, well, what if we were to do this, which is like, it fits into the schedule, but then it's like, yeah, but it doesn't deliver all the value that we are trying to deliver. Or sometimes it's like, it doesn't deliver any value at all. So this is where the conversation goes back and forth, right? So the challenge that I've seen, though, is that a lot of designers, especially if you're junior, and I was part of that. I made that mistake myself. Is like, sometimes we think that if we were to bring enough knowledge to the table, so for example, we start a conversation like this, like, from the user experience perspective, this works best because blah blah, right? We have this kind of, sometimes it's just a naive opinion that if we were to provide enough arguments, we would be able to convince the team that, let's say, to get this done, right? Say, or to proceed with our proposal, right? And I think, let's say, if you've been working on a Western, in a Western kind of environment, like a Western cultures, this goes all the way back to the ancient Greece, right? Say Plato and Aristotle, they have this idea of uh, oratory or argumentation, right? So let's say, well, this is the best thing to do because, and here's the arguments, right? Let's say, and then the problem is that the other person has the same opinions, like, well, but here are my arguments, and then you get stuck on this idea of bargaining over positions, right? And I'm gonna try to make the case that bargaining over positions doesn't really help um, on this kind of collaborative environment, right? So, and I'm gonna also be talking about, let's say, the kind of the opposite side of the spectrum, which is, and which tends to be very popular in most Eastern coaches, which is like, instead of arguing over positions, we try to reach consensus, right? What happens is, like, the more diverse the team is, the harder it becomes to get consensus. And most of the times, if consensus is about to be pure democracy or diplomacy, it doesn't work either, right? Because then we end up kind of arriving at the least common denominator. But probably the thing that makes this even more complicated is that different cultures, and this is something I think we mentioned briefly last time, is that different people have different approaches to, let's say, different views of the world. Let's say, I don't want to, I mean, I'm sharing this framework here with you guys called the cultural map by Professor Erin Meyer. She did this exercise. She's been doing this exercise for a few years now, where she started documenting or making observations about how different cultures perceive different aspects of collaboration, right? So, for example, in the case of persuasion, um, she observed this kind of continuum where some teams, some cultures prefer to have principles first, which is goes back to that idea of argumentation, right? Let's say, oh, if I were to provide enough evidence, or if I were to explain the framework of why we, or the reasons why something should be done, these are the cultures that are so-called principles first, right? Individuals have been trained to develop a theory or a complex concept before presenting a fact or a statement or opinion, right? That's how, for example, most of the law, most of the common law around the world, and the way that lawyers present their cases before judges, usually in this kind of principles first, right? Please take Professor Ehrmeyer makes the argument that some cultures like Italy, France, Spain, Russia tend to be more like in the principles first. But please take this with a grain of salt, right? Like, I guess nobody, if you're watching this and you come from any of these countries, you probably don't like to be put in a box and be, let's say, stereotyped. But let's say in general, here's my observation, what I noticed, like, in really practical terms. regardless of the culture, if people that I'm working from are from Russia or from Spain or from France, forget the countries for a second. I noticed that this idea of contrasting principles first versus application first becomes really real in day-to-day of work, and which brings us to the applications first, right? Say on the other side of the spectrum is the individuals are trained to begin with a fact or statement or opinion, and then later add the concept to back it up, right? So maybe you kind of work the other way around, right? Let's say, um, usually what it means in practical terms is this: some people just don't get convinced by just, let's say, if you present enough facts, then you get convinced, right? Um, I guess it's a long way of saying that if you try to argue over positions, usually you come, let's say this is something that you're gonna have to address from the beginning, right? Let's say you need to get away from that assumption that I'm right, you're wrong. That's usually how a lot of negotiations over positions start, right? And this only leads to, for example, one of the facts, the fact that we are in this kind of polarization here is most likely comes from this fact. Let's say that's not, I mean, I know that that's usually not how we are consciously thinking. Let's say, well, I mean, for me to win this argument, I have to prove that the other person is wrong. But let's face it, we are human beings, right? Let's say that's usually how it works. Like these difficult conversations that need to happen while we are having negotiations, most of the times it's not about getting the facts right. It's about the conflict of perceptions, right? Perceptions, interpretations, and values. For example, going back to the thing of vision, right? We created a vision. We have this artifact or a product vision statement going back to the first chat that we had. And the vision might say something, right? We want to deliver this, and like if we were to deliver this, we will achieve this value. Well, people, there's perceptions about what that value is. There's perceptions of, like, there's interpretations about that, right? So most of the times this negotiation is not about what the contract says, like, well, our product vision statement says this, right? It's not about that. It's what about what the contract means, right? So I guess, let's say, now try to get to the very practical aspect of this negotiation, right? You should try to avoid this negotiation over positions, right? Let's say you as a designer, you're presenting your designs or your concepts, and then you try to say, this is my design, this is my position, and this is and this is why my design is brilliant, and you guys need to follow along, right? Arguing over positions most of the times lock yourself in that position, right? So the more you clarify the position and the more you defend against attack, the more committed you are to it. And usually that's the place that you do not want to be, right? Remember, no matter how willing the team is to help you, and no matter how committed to deliver the vision is, sometimes there are very practical compromises that we need to make. And the more that you get committed to your design, the more you try to convince the other side of the impossibility of changing your position, sorry, which makes it very difficult to make any changes, right? And let's face it, sometimes the changes that we have to make to our designs make our designs better. It's not about, let's say, delivering less of course, let's say we need to, and we'll get sooner to that point, is like we need to look at the compromises that we're making or the adjustments that we're making through the lens of the vision, right? Is this gonna help us get closer or farther away from our vision, right? The second point is that arguing endangers the relationship, right? If you're negotiating, let's say you're haggling the price of a purchase, or for example, in your eBay, and you're going back and forth on a bid, and you're gonna buy something from someone, and you're never gonna see that person again, then yes, like you're gonna argue over your position as hard as you can. I want to make the cheapest price possible, and then the person that is the owner is gonna try the opposite, right? Say they want the highest price that they can get, right? So that's not usually what happens, right? Let's say you're in a team and you're most likely going to be on that project until the completion of that project, unless something something wrong happens. So this idea of this bargaining as over position at some point becomes like this contest of will, right? Let's say each time each side, and if you think about even the words that we're using here, let's say it should not be about sides, right? Let's say it should be everybody's a team. We're all trying to deliver. We try to all succeed together. Each side, but if you get stuck on that negotiation of a position, each side is trying to literally willpower people into that position, right? So at some point, then you start like anger and resentment starts to build up, right? So that means it can put strain on the relationship. And I think, let's say now something that is being my observation based on my experience. I've been working 25 years on UX design, and for at least the last 15 in being this really big multinational enterprise software. The more parties that you add to the mix, the position bargaining over position becomes even harder, right? Let's say if it's just you, a developer, and a product manager. Well, first, I think it needs to work as a trio. But the more positions the more parties you bring into the place, now you have testing, now you have marketing, now you have sales. It becomes really, really complicated. Every negotiation has to, let's say now you have to discuss, let's say you agree with this person, but that person disagree, and now that person disagree with the third one, and so on, right? And not to mention that in this kind of environment, if you really want a negotiation of a position, sometimes you cannot just be nice, right? Which is, I know sounds bad what I'm saying here, but some people are just hard bargainers, right? So the moment that you start bargaining over a position, the other side, quote unquote, is going to try to do the same, right? Let's say to stick to that position, right? So the and again, different teams have different cultures depending on who's helping facilitate the discussions or who's managing the team. Depending on the composition of the people that make part of the team, you have these different styles of management, right? Let's say, for example, there's team that they engage in a conversation from like a competing perspective. That's definitely not the best way of, let's say, it's probably the fastest way of achieving a goal, but probably not the best way to preserve the relationship, right? Then on the opposite side of the stream, you have the avoiding conflict, which is not the best way to achieve the goal, and probably not the best way to manage to keep the relationship in the long run, because all it does is like you're bottling up anger and resentment. But on the other hand, you just don't want to be accommodating all the time, right? Which is like, it's easy to keep the relationship when you're accommodating all the time, but it's probably not the best way to achieve the goals, right? Because, for example, if the designers is always deferring to positions from other parties without taking the needs of the user in mind, at some point the users get out of the picture. Of course, let's say a lot of cultures tend to look at compromise as the best way, right? In a sense of let's say both party wins by giving up something, but the challenge here is like, what is that you're giving up, right? Let's say, for example, some of the needs of the users are neglected, some of the performance is neglected from the software perspective, and so on, right? Let's say, what is that is being compromised here? What is that is being given up? What you want is to be in a place where the relationship is preserved, but we also achieving our goals, which is the collaborating, right? Both party wins. And this is what this, I mean, if you can, I know that project management in general it's a lot more than what I'm talking about here. At some point, you have to get to really practical things like Gantt charts and spreadsheets of costs and schedules and so on. But if nothing else, at least in my opinion, what you want is to be in this place that the team is collaborating better. And let's say one could argue that this is why the agile manifesto even came into place, right? It was not about the contracts. It was about, let's say, it's about getting the team communicating better, right? So if you want to move away from bargaining over positions, what you want is to negotiate on merit, right? And usually negotiation on merit needs to be principled. So everybody's in the team needs to jump in on a conversation from a perspective of problem solving, right? We have a problem to solve. What is the goal of that we're trying to achieve? What is the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And we try to problem solve that the most efficiently in the most amicable way possible, right? Probably something, let's say, if you cannot remember anything from this chat that we're having right now, is this one thing that I think is probably the best principle to address any kind of conflict, right? And I know we're talking about negotiation, but this is going to become very helpful when we get to the conflict resolution. Separate the people from the problem. You try to be soft on people. You try to be amicable, and I guess, let's say, from a spiritual perspective, you want to love them, right? You want to love the people in the team, but you want to be hard on the problem, right? You want to be able to, let's say, we have a problem to solve, and we need to solve it the most efficient and most amicable way possible. If we don't want to, if we want to avoid staying away from bargaining over positions, then what is that we need to focus? Well, we need to focus on interests. Like, what is the needs of the user? What is the need of the business? What are their interests, right? Focus on that instead of trying to just focus on the bottom line. I've seen a lot of teams try to design for the least common denominator. Usually what ends up happening is like you don't deliver anything of any value, right? Because let's say you're just trying to achieve, let's say, this is the approach that addresses all the challenges but doesn't change. This is the approach that addresses the minimal of all the challenges, let's say, that we are dealing with. Well, the problem is, like, if you go to the bottom line, you don't solve any of the problems well enough, right? So focus on interest, not on position. Invent options of multiple gain, right? Mutual gain. So the idea here is, before you walk into the negotiation, you need to generate alternatives to choose from. What it means in practical terms for a designer is, like, if you've been working on a design, and let's say a product manager approached you with a requirement, and I'm using air quotes here on this requirement. I hate this word requirement, by the way. If you show up with one just literally one option, if that person doesn't like, again, here is very subjective, but let's say if that whatever you're proposing is not suitable, then you're stuck, like you only get one. But if you have multiple, now we can start a negotiation, right? Say we can have, let's say, this one, like option A looks better than option B, right? So at least you have to decide. At least you have options, and which makes it easier for us to decide later. Which is why, and this is going to be something we're going to be talking a lot towards the end of this call here, is that as a designer, you should be focusing on creating choices. It's not about, let's say, here's the best solution for this. It's more about, let's say, here are 5 ways to solve this problem, right? Which brings us to the last point, which is, you need to insist on a very objective criteria of how we're gonna assess the value of solving a, let's say, an approach to solving a problem, right? In, let's say, since we're not here to debate, let's say, uh, ending the war in Ukraine or ending hunger in Africa, we're talking about problems that are much less complicated. What it means in practical terms is this: just have a very just to make sure that every time you negotiate, and negotiate here means could be, let's say, every time you're discussing any alternatives that you are proposing, have an objective criteria, which is why we're going to talk a lot about towards the end of the call about critiques. Have a standard way of discussing your designs through critiques, right? So let's talk about this idea of creating choices, right? Let's say design is about, at least in my opinion, right? Let's say, and I think I've learned, I mean, I learned early on in my career by taking the advice of Bill Buxton, right? That if we don't have multiple solutions to answer any question, the process is vulnerable to this bargaining over positions, right? Without the ability to see all the work at once, let's say, and here's like 5 different ways of solving this problem and be able to compare, relationships between the components of the problem are going to be missed, right? So I guess it's a long way of saying that as a designer, you should be exploring and comparing methods of alternatives. It's not just one path, right? Given at any time or any given question, you have to have multiple alternatives, right? And most of the time, and here's something that I think the designers tend to kind of, if you haven't been doing this long enough, you don't realize this. Most of the times it's not, let's say, even if you were to create 5 options, by the way, Bill Buxton, this is like, he said, like, when he used to work for Microsoft, that's usually the challenge that he will put to the designers. Let's say for any given problem we're solving, you have to have 5 equally reasonably implementable ways of solving the problem, right? And most of the times it's like, even if it's not so much about you have 5 and then you pick one, most often than not, it's going to be like, even that one that ends up making it to the product is actually a compromise or a mixture of the 5, right? Again, a very catchy way of thinking about it is this, and this is something that I've tried to encourage teams to think about. It's like, your decision can be no better than your best alternative, right? So that's why you have to generate multiple alternatives, and that's when the discussions begin about, let's say, what is the best, quote unquote, right? So from that perspective, it is step number 1 to reduce the friction and reduce this kind of anger and resentment of, let's say, this entrenchment between like my idea versus your idea. Well, make it multiple ideas to begin with. Let's say, by the way, you need to get in that mindset. Is like, once you present it, it's not yours anymore, it's the team's, right? But even if you, until you build up that mindset, think about it. Let's say, to remove some of the friction of these negotiations, have multiple options, because then you cannot get to, let's say, I've seen a lot of and if I could be very direct and upfront with you, I've seen a lot of teams that, let's say, you present an approach, and usually the relationship, let's say, the reaction is like a binary, let's say yes or no, right? And then you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and start again. If you are presenting multiple alternatives, you cannot, let's say, you automatically get the team out of that binary relationship. They cannot just say no. They have to pick. If nothing else, they have to at least pick one, because it's going to make them look really, really not willing to cooperate if they just say no, right? So this is one way. The other way to kind of get out of that bargaining of positions, or is to, instead of making the argument, is to have a facilitated discussion around and in a form of a critique. And I'm gonna have to probably explain what I mean by critique here. I've noticed that in different, I've been working in multiple continents right now. I spent some time in China. I'm originally from Brazil, and now I've been living in Germany for the last 10 years. I noticed that some people, when they hear this word critique, in some languages, critique has a very neutral meaning. In some cultures, critique has a very critical meaning. So that means people tend to react negatively. So what I mean by critique here is, let's have an objective discussion on the merits of the idea, right? So a critique helps the team to converge on an alternative, on alternatives, during the generation of ideas, right? And if you remember, if you haven't watched that, the second part of this series, I'll encourage you to do that again. We presented this concept of, let's say, divergent and convergent thinking, right? So a critique is one of the techniques that you can help to get teams to converge, right? So what you're trying to do is to help the team focus on analyzing the design, not based on their opinions, but based on the objective of what is that we're trying to achieve here. In this case, for example, if you're working on a product, it's not about what, let's say, my opinions about how the design should work, but more about like, how well does this design or this approach, whatever is that we're trying to solve here, addresses the objective of our project, um, of our team, right? And this is the part that usually, and I noticed that some teams really struggle with this concept of critique because it takes a little bit of a preparation, right? Let's say it takes you to, it's not just work on some mock-ups in Figma and put the mock-ups on the wall, or put the mock-ups on the screen, and then people just give their opinions. Like, it's probably, let's say, just share the mock-ups over email. It's probably the fastest way. But usually what happens is, if that discussion is not facilitated, all you get is comments like, I don't like blue, or can you make this button bigger, and so on, right? What you want is like to have an object, or at least the least subjective conversation possible about how is this design better than what's there in the product? How does it help address the problems, and for whom that design is addressing the problems from, right? So, and again, I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but it's actually better to have your work critiqued by your colleagues while still there's time to do something about it, than to have it finished, the finished project torn apart. And usually what happens, right? Say, let's say you have the project is 3 months, and the designer's been working with the developers, and in the first month you have to come propose a design, right? If you wait for the last day of that first month to have it critique, what might end up happening is, let's say, you make all kinds of compromises, and then the developers implement it, and because you haven't discussed it long enough on the team, you ended up finding the problems, or let's say the shortcomings of that design once the product is live. And at that point, is either very expensive to roll back the changes, sometimes even impossible, but probably the worst case scenario is it hurts the reputation of your brand. You have people talking negatively on the internet about your product, and so on. So no matter how difficult the criticism might be, you better think about having that conversation earlier than later. So, and again, so critique, if you haven't watched the second part of this series, this is what I was talking about, divergent and convergent thinking, right? Let's say you want to have, it's great to do a lot of brainstorming. This divergent thinking is great to explore solutions, but the critique is not the only way to do it, but it's one of the ways that you can get the teams to converge. Let's say, what is the approach that we're taking and why, right? So it gets very objective, right? So now let's talk to the hard part, right? And I think a lot of, at least I've been doing this for 25 years, and I noticed that this is probably the part of collaborating that the teams struggle the most, right? Say, how do you resolve conflicts, right? I mean, and this is, and like it or not, every team is potentially dysfunctional. And the reason why is this: we are human beings, right? We are fallible, we are imperfect. So it's only natural that when we are collaborating, we have difference of opinions of how to get something done. And to prove, I hope I can prove my point by making a very strong statement here. Is like, even you don't agree with yourself. And I'll prove it to you. Let's say first day of New Year, you start with some resolution. I'm gonna lose weight. I'm gonna go back to the gym, and I'm gonna I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna get on a diet. I'm gonna eat better and so on. How long does that New Year's resolution last? Um, a week, 2 weeks, 3 months, and so on. At some point, it's like, yeah, I know that I said that I committed to that, but just too hard. And sometimes it's not even conscious, right? So it's not like you decided, let's say that first year resolution was stupid. I'm going away. Sometimes you know it's the right thing to do. It's just that you don't want to do it, right? So we are human beings. We are imperfect, right? So that means we need to just deal with an aspect of the human condition, which is just deal with conflicts better, right? So of course, let's say we need to be mindful of, let's say, especially if you're working in a professional environment, you do need to you should not be putting with all kinds of conflict, right? Say in one extreme, you kind of have this artificial harmony, right, where there's no conflict at all, right? On the other extreme, you have this kind of mean-spirited personal attacks, right? And that's not good either, right? So what you want is to live somewhere in the middle where conflict is constructive, right? Say it's about people sharing, it's about diversity of opinions. Everybody shares their perspective. We collaborate, and then we arrive at some sort of a shared understanding and a shared vision of where we want to be, right? What might end up happening is that this is usually not possible, right? Even the best teams will rarely, but occasionally, kind of step out of the line, right? Say we tend to collaborate really well, but then this issue arrives, and then conflict flares up, right? So what we want, like what we want, is to create this culture that every time the conflict arises, the team is able to recover from it, right? Let's say recover in a sense, let's say like facilitate a discussion and agree on what is the approach that we want to take. So that whenever something, first, we want to avoid something becoming destructive, but also we want to build the confidence. So let's say next time that conflict arises, we know like we know how to deal better with it, right? Conflict is, I guess, let's say, I mean, and I'll break it very, very hard to you. Conflict is natural and it can never be eliminated. And I guess at some point you don't want it to be eliminated, because what usually in a place that there is no conflict, what might end up happening is like there's this artificial harmony. People might say that there is no conflict, but in the back of their minds there's some anger, some resentments, things are bottling up, right? So let's say, if conflicts are not managed properly, they can lead into really dysfunctional behaviors, right? And consequences, like sometimes could be turned into even violent, right? On the other hand, when conflict is managed effectively, it can really like stimulate creativity, innovation, and change, right? So if you think about some some companies or cultures that tend to be very creative, there's usually a diversity of opinion there, right? So while conflict is natural, what we want is to step up to the plate with this really non-judgmental attitudes towards the team, right? So that we can all expect the best in a very counterintuitive way, not really anticipate conflicts. Then how do you resolve conflicts? As I said, I'm not a I'm not I'm not a personal I'm not a perfect human being. I myself deal with conflicts all the time. Sometimes I'm not the best. I mean, sometimes I create conflicts in some cases. So what I'm gonna share with you here is some of the things that I either tried and it worked for me, or things that I'm trying to challenge myself to do it, right? So when it comes to conflict resolution, there's this four things that I think really helps, right? Let's say apart from the negotiation techniques that we mentioned, right? Say avoid bargaining over positions, but focus on merit, and then having great critiques approaches. First is like establishing some rituals to address challenge in the team, right? So for example, in Agile, you have things like retrospectives that the team can engage after the end of every sprint. That's a ritual. We should leverage on rituals like this, because the more that we know that there's a safe space for us to address conflicts, then the less we bottle up things. The other thing is about clarity of vision, right? And I spoke a lot in the first part of this series, that if we have a shared understanding of what the problems we're trying to solve and for whom, and what is the place that we want to be once we deliver this feature or this product or this project, is going to be the discussions around how to get there are going to be a lot more objective, and or at least less subjective to people's personal agendas. The other thing, I think it helps a lot, especially if you're working on teams that have kind of under pressure of deadlines, is to have a clarity of priorities, right? There's 10, let's say, going back to the five, Bill Buxton's five ideas to solve a problem, right? Usually what happens is, like, if the team gets stuck on deciding which way to proceed, well, maybe priorities, let's say, well, but like if we, for example, the typical challenge of enterprise software is like there's multiple personas or multiple types of customers that we need to address. Is there one type of customer or persona that is the most important for our business objectives right now? Or is there a specific problem that is more important to solve than the other, right? And we're going to get into the detail of that in a second, right? But and probably, and now let's say if you're just talking about literally the day-to-day dynamics of the team, the one thing that I think helps the most in addressing conflict is to have clarity of roles and responsibilities, right? So if you know who needs to do what by when, and like how to make decisions on a team, that already takes a lot of the pressure out. So let's go back to rituals, right? Let's say I mentioned the retrospectives in Scrum is one type of ritual, but you as a facilitator or a project manager, you could establish other rituals, right? Say that there's a couple of resources that I found very useful. One that I personally am gonna try to use as much as in the rare occasions that we do have a flared up conflict. There's this idea of burn the argument, right? Let's say, and this is the thing about rituals, right? That they are kind of symbolic, right? Let's say after, in this case of burn the argument, is like this idea of after a conflict, you can have the teams to write down, let's say, how they emotionally feel about it, right? And then they burn those pieces of paper. Let's say, of course, you cannot do this inside the office. You have to go somewhere outside. But the idea here is like there's this symbolism of burning up the argument and let it go, right? Instead of hoping that people will be able to move on, you explicitly write the argument down. How do you feel about it? Then you burn it, then you let it go, right? Of course, let's say this takes everyone to agree on, let's say you have to listen to everybody's point of view, right? And after people wrote it down, then you kind of burn it up, right? So let's say this is not the only ritual that you could think about it, but well, I guess what I'm trying to say is like there is this event or this procedure or this ritual that helps people address the conflict, right? Then I guess, let's say I talked a lot about in the second part of actually the first part of this series about vision, that if you have a strong enough vision, it should really bring clarity around like what are the problems we're trying to solve and why. And if you remember those 6 questions, right? Let's say what are our aspirations, what are our challenges, what will we focus on? These are the questions that are closer to vision. So if you think about it, anytime that there's I'll argue that the vision will happen like every time that we arrive at a conflict. And now I'm not talking about literally this kind of really anger, resentment kind of conflict, but I'm talking about, let's say there's conflict of opinions, like we should do A or B. Well, then if you have a strong vision, or you should have an objective way of discussing. Let's say, well, how does option A help us achieve our aspirations? How does option A help us address our challenges? Is option A something that is part of the things that we said that we were going to focus on? And then you can do the same thing with option B and C and D and so on, right? So the idea here is like the vision will turn these discussions around conflicts a lot more objective, right? So this is clarity of vision. Then clarity of priorities, right? And this is something that I see a lot of teams struggle, because every time that, let's say, every release or every iteration or every sprint, whatever is that time that you have to discuss what is that we're gonna do, no matter how strong the vision is, if you haven't discussed that part of, let's say, what is our focus or what are the things that we are purposely not going to do to make sure that we focus on the things that we must do, if we don't have that clear sense of prioritization, you're going to get stuck on, we could do A and B and C and D, like which one? We can only do one at a time, for example. Let's say, and usually that's how backlogs work, right? So you have this idea of, you have a very long list of things, and if the team is really in their best interest trying to deliver everything that's in the backlog, usually what usually ends up happening is like you pick the first item on the backlog, and then you go to the second one, and then you go to the third one, right? If nothing else, if it's a stack rank of things that you want to work on, which one is the first, which one is the second? You have to have some sort of objective criteria of how you're going to prioritize things, right? And usually what slows progress and wastes people's time is that this confusion about, let's say, what is priority? Let's say, is the priority to make things, like person A might think that, say, priority is to make things faster, but person B thinks that, let's say, we should make the product more stable, right? And this is usually where it leads, and this is not to say one is right or wrong. It's just, let's say, not only we are different as people, but the roles that we have in the teams are different, right? So for example, UX designer should be advocating for the user's needs, right? The product manager should be advocating for the business, right? Let's say these are the financial goals that we need to achieve. The development team is advocating for the stability and the quality of the code, right? So it's only natural that let's say there's going to be a conflict of priorities here, right? So that's why you should have some sort of criteria for prioritizing things. Let's say, what is our You could ask a couple questions to the team. Let's say, what is our prioritization policy, right? How do we compare and contrast each item on our backlog and know like which ones are help us achieve our vision and our goals? The example that I'm putting here on the screen is a prioritization formula, right? Let's say where you have, let's say, customer needs as value and business needs as value, right? Let's say, for example, if option A is gathering, let's say, well, option A help us address this need 1 and 2 from the customer and help us achieve business need 1 and 2 from our perspective as a product development organization, divided by the effort that it takes. And effort could mean many things. Let's say the effort from the designer side, effort from the development side, effort from testing, and so on, from operations, times our confidence on the on our estimates, and that should arrive at priority. And usually what happens is, like, when I show this to teams, they get really caught up on the formula, right? And it's not so much about is the formula is, like, for example, feature A got priority 7.2, and then feature B got priority 6.9, and then now you get stuck on this endless discussion, like 7.2 or 6.8 or 6.9. It's not so much about the formula itself, but it's more about making the making the conversation a little bit more objective about how do we decide around priorities, right? So the next thing that we want to talk about is clarity of roles and responsibilities, right? And usually UX kind of gets stuck in the middle of, I mean, stuck maybe is not necessarily the right word, but given the way that how most digital products are developed, there's usually like some functional group that is responsible for the requirements. And again, I hate this word requirements. And there's a team that actually makes those requirements real into the product, right? So usually software development. In some organizations, the designers report to product managers. In some organizations, designers report to the development organization. Sometimes developers are a separate organization altogether. In either case, depending on how the arrangement is made, who decides, right? Say, for example, there's 3 different ways, but then we need to arrive at a compromise. Does the designer get the power, quote unquote, to decide? Is it the product manager? Is it the developer? Then how do we arbitrate if we ever get to that point, like who should make the decision or not, right? That's why in a few teams, they actually want to, let's say, especially the really most successful organizations, the one that really want to keep the team engaged and keep a momentum high, they have some of these best practices and rituals of establishing things like, for example, let's negotiate a contract of how do we collaborate here. For example, that's why the team canvas was created. When you define roles up front, when you agree, let's say, this is what the goals of our team is, this is what we value, this is how we make decisions, and so on. The more that you have kind of this upfront discussion with your team, the less likely is that you're going to keep going back and forth and renegotiate all that every time, right? Of course, let's say it doesn't make all the problems go away, but it helps, right? In a sense, let's say it's not like people are completely clueless about how do we collaborate here. But now let me get to the part that I think is the ultimate way of addressing conflict, which is building up trust. And this is probably the best way to address conflict, but it's probably the hardest way. If we knew how to do it, going back and again at the time of this recording, we're having a war in Ukraine now. Usually this kind of conflicts start because people just don't trust each other, right? Of course, let's say I don't want this to be about, let's say, the idea of focusing on the negative. In the business environment, we should be focusing on the positive, right? Say the level of trust that you put in the relationships usually is the greatest determinant of success, right? Say the more that people trust you and you trust them, the more likely is that the negotiations or compromises or whatever transactions that happen are going to be for the benefit of the team. So the single most important thing that you can do to improve collaboration with the team is just to build trust and establish rapport, right? Um, and again, we are all different people, so the challenge that is that different cultures again, and I want you to take this with a grain of salt, right? Different cultures tend to even define trust in different ways, right? Let's say there's the cognitive trust, or let's say how do I establish trust in the way that we work, and then there's the emotional trust, right? Say based on the history of our interactions, can I trust you with, let's say for example, something more personal? Can I confide in you and so on, right? And again, Professor Erin Meyer, she observed this continuum of trust, where let's say in one end of the spectrum you have the task-based trust, or let's say that um, trust is built through the related activities, like let's say I in the past that person never let me down. She's very consistent, very professional. She's always on time and so on. On the other end of the spectrum is the relationship based trust, right? Let's say, do I like quote unquote that person, right? And again, I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing. I can only speak for my own culture, right? I mean, if I could speak, it's about my own culture, right? For example, originally coming from Brazil, is there's a lot more work, quote unquote, or there's a lot more business decisions that happen over coffee, literally like drinking coffee, than it happens on meeting rooms, right? In some cases, people in and in Brazil is definitely the same, but based on the time that I spend in Asia, in China, and then looking at kind of how the relationships happen in a lot of these Asian cultures, there's a lot more personal things that need to happen. Let's say if you need to spend time with, let's say, having dinner with people, or singing karaoke and so on, before the business relationships can get off the ground, versus, let's say, in some cultures, for example, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing. Probably some of you are going to put in on the comments there, that's not how, I mean, I am from Germany and then I don't feel this way, but I mean, I guess, let's say, more observation that I done since I got here is definitely people tend to be a lot more divide uh, professional from personal a lot more than in other countries that I lived in, right? So that means when when my office hours are finished, I go home and I separate my work life from my private life, right? Again, I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing, but if you can relate to what I'm saying, if you disagree with the opinions of Professor Aaron Meyer, just leave a comment down below, and I'd love to know what you think of her opinions there. Um, but here's why building trust is so hard, right? Because probably the best way to build trust, and going back to the idea of, let's say, try to stick in the continuum of staying, let's say, staying away from this kind of artificial harmony, but also on the other hand, let's say, not being hurt by really mean-spirited attacks. The probably the best way to deal with, to build trust will be vulnerability, right? Professor Patrick Lencioni and Professor Brene Brown, they speak at length about this idea of trust-based, vulnerability-based trust, right? When team members trust each other, they feel comfortable being open and sometimes even exposed to each other's failures, weaknesses, and fears, right? And if it sounds really touchy feeling, it's stuff as like I mean, trust me, is really not just about, let's say, kumbaya and everybody feels happy of working together. It really makes a difference on the on, let's say, the way that we engage with each other. And the way to think about it is, think of someone that you really trust, right? Say, forget the professional environment for a second. Just think of someone that you share your deepest feelings and thoughts, right? The only reason that person is able to, let's say, to get your confidence is because you feel vulnerable in front of, let's say, you're vulnerable with her, but you know that she's not gonna hurt you, right? Let's say you feel comfortable to share with you your fears, your weaknesses, and so on. And that person in turn is able to provide with some really insightful, deep thoughts on, this is what you should do, and or this is not what, or this, you shouldn't do this, right? If you really care, if you really care about that person and that person cares about you, you're really, you feel open to share with her, right? Let's say the same thing opens in works in a professional environment, probably to a lesser degree, but instead of being on the personal side of things, it's more about the project, right? Right. And here's the thing that, let's say, that's the kind of the hardest part of this whole process of dealing with conflict, is this: you can only speak for yourself, right? Say, you cannot make people vulnerable, you cannot make people trust you. All you can do is work on your part of of letting, being a little bit more vulnerable, which is it's a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of courage, right? Let's say for teams, especially um, especially from young age, right? We don't want to be hurt, right? Say, we don't want to expose, open up ourselves just to be hurt. Which is why um, which is why what we want to, the place that we want to be, is where the teams have this psychological safety that they know that they can share their opinions, they can share the fears. So, for example, forget the personal fears, just thinking about projects, right? Say, I fear that if we were to do this, the project is going to land in this place, and then we can have an objective discussion about, is this a good place or a bad place? For example, when we start talking about risks, right? Like, one of the most important components of project management is risk management, right? So if you're gonna bring up a risk to a team, how are you gonna bring that up if you don't feel like, if you feel like every time you're gonna bring this up, you're gonna be either punished or humiliated for speaking up, right? Let's say the teams, people are gonna be less likely to talk about risks and fears and stuff if they fear that they're gonna be punished and humiliated, right? So again, if you're the project manager, or if you're a leader, or if you're someone that is kind of responsible for facilitating a discussion on the team, then is your responsibility to kind of create that psychological safety. While you cannot make people feel psychologically safe, you need to strive and to create that culture of saying, for example, there's not gonna be any retaliation for speaking up. You're not gonna be punished. You're not gonna be humiliated, right? And even something as simple as, let's say, the language that we use should not be violent. And I'm gonna make some links available on the comments of this talk, where we talk about some practical tips of psychological safety and 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 nonviolent communication. But is, let's say, again, you can only do, if you're not the manager, if you're not the leader, all you can do is your part, right? Say, you try to trust people, you try to be open with people, you try to use nonviolent language and so on, right? Again, this is a long way of saying that conflict is inevitable, but with psychological safety, it makes it possible to channel that energy into productive interaction, right? Which means that people are open for ideas and they learn from different point of views, right? Then how do you create the psychological safety? Well, again, it might not be the most natural thing to think about it, but this is where communication and facilitation skills can come in, right? You can establish some sort of a team contract, maybe not complicated as a team canvas, but a team contract that focuses on how do you collaborate more on the person, more on the practical things that affects psychological safety. For example, what is cool or not cool to do in this team? What is in versus out, right? Let's say at the beginning of the project, or whenever someone or new teams are forming, or when new talent joins in the team, or some radical changes. Let's say, I don't know about your experience, but in the enterprise software, there's reorgs all the time. That's when maybe you need to kind of rewrite the contract of some of the things that are cool or not cool to do, right? So for example, right, let's say, um, um, we always seek to understand first. We always on time. We listen to each other. You know, like some of the things, the examples you're seeing on the screen are kind of obvious. So one could argue that why do we even need to bother to write it down that we need to listen to each other? Well, because we put it down on paper, now we should mean it, right? And then when we having a conflict, we can always point to our contract. Let's say, well, we said in our contracts that we are open to ideas. I don't feel like we are open to ideas whenever this happens, and so on. Or we said in our contracts that we come to meetings prepared. Yet I send my designs to be reviewed and nobody read the presentation before, or nobody replied to my mail before coming to the meeting. So you can start bringing up the contract whenever you are talking about the relationship, right? And I didn't want this to be about this is not the only ways to resolve conflict, and there's a lot more to do than this to resolve conflicts. I'm not going to claim I'm an expert, but I really hope that you've learned some techniques from this, right? This is only a short presentation about conflict and issue resolution. I wish I had more time, but if you I made this in the comments of this presentation of this chat, you're gonna see some links to more resources. But here's the encouragement I want to make it to you. Some of these conversations are really hard, right? This is not easy. If conflict resolution was not easy, we wouldn't have so much war and hunger around the world. But I hope that the references that you saw are gonna start some great conversations in your team. You can always try, ask the team if they're open to try something new if you're struggling. If you don't feel like you can use these techniques, or maybe you're not in the position that you can actually decide any of this to do, maybe you want to kind of enlist someone to help you. Maybe you want to engage with your scrum master or your project manager. It's like, hey, maybe you want to share with someone, right? But again, just a quick reminder, right? Let's say this is so what we covered today is conflict and issue resolution. This is part 3 of a five-part series, and we're going to be talking next about effective decision making, and then we're going to wrap up this series with communication and stakeholder management. I really hope that you found this conversation useful. If you have any questions or any comments, please leave them down below, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.